In 1859, a solar storm set telegraph wires on fire. If it happened today, it wouldn't just kill your Wi-Fi, it would erase the modern world. Scientists call it the Carrington event, a geomagnetic superstorm so violent that auroras lit up the skies over Cuba, and telegraph operators received electric shocks from their own equipment. For a world powered by candlelight and horse-drawn carriages, it was a curiosity. For our civilization, strung together by satellites, power grids, and GPS, it would be an extinction-level event for technology itself. And right now, the sun is acting up. The AR 4366 sunspot region has become what scientists are calling a solar flare factory, unleashing X8 class eruptions that make the headlines seem almost quaint. The question isn't if another Carrington event will happen, it's when and whether we'll see it coming before the lights go out for good. Subscribe and follow along, because the clock is ticking, and what happens in the coming hours could redefine what solar storm means in the satellite age. In 1859, we lost some telegraph wires. In 2025, we could lose everything that makes modern life possible. The difference isn't the sun, it's us. Something happened on the sun in the first few days of February 2025, and most people scrolled right past it. An active region called AR 4366 produced an X8.1 flare, the third most powerful solar eruption we have recorded during solar cycle 25. Radio signals blacked out across the South Pacific. Scientists sat down, pulled up their models, and started asking a question that is not about what already happened. It is about what comes next. Because here is the thing nobody is talking about on the news. The flare itself was not the real threat. The real threat is where this region is pointing, and whether it is finished firing. Let me back up just a little. Between February 1st and February 3rd, AR 4366 did not just produce one big flare. It produced at least 5 X-class flares, and more than 20 M-class flares in rapid succession. That is not normal behavior for a single sunspot region. Professionals have started calling it a solar flare factory, and when you hear scientists reach for a phrase like that, it means the numbers are genuinely unusual. These are not people who exaggerate for attention. They use cautious language for a reason, and the fact that they are reaching for more dramatic terms tells you something important about what they are watching. The region itself grew at a pace that caught observers off guard. AR 4366 started as a minor speck on the solar surface and expanded to roughly 550 microhemispheres in a matter of days. To put that in perspective, that is approximately half the size of the famous Carrington sunspot from 1859. Half the size, and it got there fast. Solar physicists track these regions constantly, and watching one balloon to that scale in such a short window is the kind of thing that gets people paying very close attention. What makes AR 4366 structurally dangerous is something called a delta-class magnetic configuration. That term sounds technical, and it is, but the concept is surprisingly simple. Imagine two magnets with opposite poles being forced together and held in place. The magnetic field lines twist and tangle like cables being wound tighter and tighter. Energy builds up across those tangled lines, stored like tension in a coil. That stored energy is not imaginary. It is measurable, and it is enormous. Delta-class regions are the regions that produce the biggest, most violent solar flares because they have the most magnetic stress packed into a single space. Here is what makes AR 4366 genuinely anomalous. And this is the part that has solar physicists leaning forward in their chairs. When a region like this produces a major flare, you would normally expect some of that magnetic complexity to discharge. The twisted cables release some of their tension. The region should, in theory, calm down at least a little. AR-4366 has not done that. It has kept firing, kept rebuilding, kept maintaining that complex, unstable magnetic structure, even after multiple major eruptions. That is not the expected behavior. That is the behavior of a system that has not yet found its way to equilibrium. Picture a loaded gun sitting on a table. The gun is quiet. It is not making noise. Nothing is visibly wrong. But underneath that silence, every mechanism is cocked and ready. That is roughly the situation we are looking at with AR-4366 right now. The solar wind coming off the sun in this period has been relatively calm, reading between 300 and 400 kilometers per second, which is on the lower end of normal. But underneath that calm surface, there is a magnetically hyperactive region that has repeatedly shown it can produce catastrophic energy releases. The quiet wind does not protect us from what that region is capable of. It is important to be clear about what has not happened, because in this story, the things that have not happened yet matter just as much as the things that have. As of the most recent data, AR-4366 has not produced an Earth-directed halo coronal mass ejection. There has been no major geomagnetic storm hitting our atmosphere. We have not seen the kind of event that would send satellites scrambling or knock out power grids. We are not in crisis mode, but we are not relaxed either. The distinction between those two states matters enormously, and understanding why requires us to think about something that most people never consider when they read a space weather headline. The central question is not whether AR-4366 has produced big flares. It has. The question is whether this region is safely burning off its stored energy in manageable bursts, or whether it is failing to discharge properly, building towards something much larger. That is a question scientists cannot answer with confidence right now, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes this situation worth paying attention to. AR-4366 is rotating across the face of the sun, moving toward a position where its eruptions would be aimed directly at Earth. What it decides to do when it gets there is the part of this story we cannot yet write. To understand why that alignment matters more than raw power, we need to go back to 1859, and we need to strip away every myth that has been built around what actually happened that year. Most people have heard the name Carrington event, the way you hear the name of a natural disaster in a history class, as a single, explosive, once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe that happened a long time ago and will probably never happen again. That story is wrong. Not entirely, but wrong in the ways that matter most. The 1859 event was not simply the biggest solar storm ever recorded. It was a specific combination of factors that lined up in a way that turned an already powerful event into something almost incomprehensibly destructive. Understanding that difference is the difference between treating this as a curiosity and treating it as a warning. The event itself has become almost legendary in its retelling. Telegraph operators in Europe and North America watched their machines spark violently, some of the equipment catching fire. Auroras, the green and red lights normally confined to the Arctic and Antarctic regions, were visible as far south as the tropics. People in Cuba, in Hawaii, in parts of South America looked up and saw the sky lit up in colors that had no business being there. It was, by any measure, a spectacular and terrifying event. But when you start stripping away the folklore and the dramatic embellishments that have accumulated over 166 years of retelling, what remains is a story that is actually more interesting than the myth. The Carrington flare was powerful, but it was not necessarily the most powerful flare the sun has ever produced. What made it so devastating was a set of technical factors that most popular accounts skip entirely, because those factors require a little patience to understand. The first is that the magnetosphere, the invisible shield of charged particles surrounding Earth, had already been weakened by earlier solar activity in the days before the main event. The sun had been active beforehand, and that activity had already stressed and partially opened Earth's magnetic defenses. The big CME, the coronal mass ejection, did not slam into a fresh, fully intact shield. It hit something that was already compromised. The second factor is that the Carrington event was not a single blast. It was multiple phases of coronal mass ejection, arriving in sequence, each one interacting with the previous one and with the magnetosphere in ways that compounded the damage. Think of it less like one punch and more like a series of hits from different angles, each one making the next one land harder. The telegraph systems of that era acted almost like accidental detectors of this compounding effect. Telegraph lines were long, thin conductors stretched across continents. They had no surge protection of any kind. When the changing magnetic field from the storm induced electrical currents in those lines, there was nothing to absorb or redirect that energy. It went straight into the equipment, and the equipment burned. Here is the reframe that changes everything about how we should think about solar storms. Carrington was not the strongest possible flare. It was a worst-case alignment event. The geometry was nearly perfect for maximum damage, and that geometry is something we can learn to watch for, which makes it more relevant today, not less. The most important piece of that geometry is something called the BZ orientation, which refers to the direction of the magnetic field carried by the coronal mass ejection as it reaches Earth. When that field points southward, it interacts with Earth's own magnetic field in a way that essentially opens a door in our magnetic shield. Southward BZ is the key that unlocks the worst outcomes. This means we do not need a repeat of an X40 or X45 class flare to see Carrington-level damage. An X15 or X20 class flare, which is well within the range of what regions like AR4366 are capable of producing, could be catastrophic if it arrives with a southward BZ orientation. The power of the flare matters, but the magnetic alignment matters more. An X50 flare with the wrong orientation might barely graze us. An X15 with the right, or rather the worst, orientation could cripple critical infrastructure on a global scale. There is a forecasting blind spot here that makes this particularly unsettling. Scientists can track the speed and general direction of a coronal mass ejection as it leaves the sun. We have gotten reasonably good at that, but the magnetic orientation of that ejection, the BZ direction, is often not reliably known until the CME is already very close to Earth, sometimes only hours before impact. We are, in many cases, forecasting the shape of the bullet without knowing which way it is spinning until it is almost at our door. Modern confidence in our ability to predict and prepare for these events is, frankly, more fragile than it appears. Better instruments and better models are real achievements. No one is disputing that. But better does not mean sufficient. And there is a meaningful gap between knowing something is coming and being able to say exactly how bad it will be until it arrives. The Carrington event does not repeat itself in exactly the same way twice. But the conditions that made it possible are not unique to 1859. AR4366 is not the same size as the Carrington sunspot, but it shares the same structural characteristics, the same delta-class complexity, the same capacity to produce sustained, violent eruptions. The geometry risk is not hypothetical. It is familiar. And the most unsettling truth about the Carrington event is this: even with everything we know now, even with every satellite and every monitoring station we have built, we still would not see a repeat of 1859 coming clearly until hours before it hit. There is a category of sunspot region that solar physicists watch more carefully than any other, and AR4366 belongs to it. It is called a delta-class region, and the name itself does not tell you much, but the behavior does. A delta-class region is one where magnetic polarities of opposite sign exist within the same penumbra, which is the dark band surrounding a sunspot. Think of it as two magnets that should be on opposite sides of a room, forced into the same small space, and held there by the sun's own churning magnetic field. The tension that creates is not subtle. It is the magnetic equivalent of a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. Delta regions are the regions that produce the strongest flares known to solar science. The reason is surprisingly straightforward once you understand the structure. When opposite magnetic polarities are packed together, the field lines connecting them become extraordinarily tangled. Magnetic reconnection, the process by which those tangled lines snap and release their stored energy, happens more violently and more frequently in delta regions than anywhere else on the Sun. Each reconnection event is an explosion. In a delta region, those explosions can chain together, feeding off each other, producing flares that dwarf anything a simpler sunspot group could manage. A useful way to picture the energy dynamics is to imagine a web of rubber bands stretched across a room, each one wound tighter than the last, and some of them crossing over others at odd angles. When one rubber band snaps, the sudden release of tension yanks on the others. Some of them snap too. The energy does not disappear cleanly. It redistributes, and sometimes that redistribution creates new points of tension that were not there before. That is roughly what happens inside a delta region during a major flare sequence. The release of energy in one location does not guarantee stability in the surrounding magnetic structure. It can, in fact, create new instabilities. AR 4366 has exhibited several behaviors that fall outside the typical pattern for even active delta regions. And these are the behaviors that have solar physicists watching it with particular attention. The region has shown sustained magnetic reconnection lasting hours at a time, not the quick, sharp bursts you would expect from a single flare event. It has also produced what are sometimes called triple-peaked flares, where the energy output rises, partially drops, rises again even higher, and then drops again. That kind of repeated peaking suggests that the magnetic structure is not resolving itself between eruptions. It is re-energizing, finding new points of tension, and firing again from a structure that remains fundamentally complex. Why does sustained reconnection matter so much more than a single big flare? Because a single flare, even a very large one, represents energy being released from one point in the magnetic structure. Sustained reconnection across multiple fault lines means the region is not just firing once and settling. It is actively churning through its own magnetic architecture, and that churning can either lead to a gradual unwinding of the complexity, or it can lead to a catastrophic reorganization where all the stored energy discharges at once. Those are very different outcomes, and from the outside, watching the region behave, it can be genuinely difficult to tell which path it is on. There is a hypothesis, and it is important to flag this as speculative, that regions like AR 4366 may follow one of two broad patterns. The first is gradual exhaustion, where the region slowly burns through its magnetic complexity over days or weeks, producing frequent but manageable flares as it does. The second is singular discharge, where the complexity builds past a critical threshold and releases in one massive event. Solar physicists debate which pattern is more likely for any given region, and the honest answer is that the tools we have for predicting which path a specific region will take are still limited. Some analysts have started paying particular attention to proton signatures as a potential indicator of where AR 4366 is heading. Proton events, where energetic particles are accelerated to dangerous speeds by solar eruptions, are sometimes treated as signals that a region is escalating in intensity rather than winding down. The science here is not settled. There is active debate about how reliable proton signatures are as predictive indicators versus simply being byproducts of flare activity. But the fact that experienced scientists are watching them closely tells you something about how seriously this region is being taken. The question that no one can answer with confidence right now is whether AR 4366 has peaked in its magnetic complexity. Has it reached the most tangled, most stressed state it is going to reach? And is it now slowly unwinding? Or is it still building, still adding layers of complexity beneath the activity we can observe? Solar physicists cannot answer that question definitively with current instruments, and that is not a failure of technology so much as it is a reflection of how genuinely difficult these systems are to read from the outside. Delta regions do not follow a schedule that we set. They do not discharge on command, and they do not calm down because we would prefer them to. They behave according to their own internal dynamics, and those dynamics are, at this point in human understanding, only partially transparent to us. Here is a counterintuitive idea that most space weather coverage gets completely wrong. The coronal mass ejection from the X-8.1 flare largely missed Earth. It did not slam into our magnetosphere with full force. And at first glance, that sounds like good news. The kind of headline that lets you breathe a sigh of relief and scroll to the next article. But when you look at what a near miss actually means in the context of an active, sustained flare factory like AR-4366, the picture gets considerably more complicated. A miss is not always the clean reprieve it appears to be. The trajectory modeling for coronal mass ejections is good but not perfect. Early path estimates for a CME can shift as the ejection interacts with the solar wind, with other CMEs, and with the magnetic environment between the Sun and Earth. Scientists have gotten better at tracking these trajectories over time, but better and precise are not the same word, and there is a meaningful margin of uncertainty in the early hours and days after an ejection. The X-8.1 CME was assessed as mostly missing Earth, but there is also the possibility of what is called a glancing blow, where the outer edge of the CME clips the magnetosphere without delivering a full impact. A glancing blow is not nothing. Partial magnetic coupling between a passing CME and Earth's magnetic field can still produce measurable effects, and in the context of a magnetosphere that has already been stressed by repeated activity, even partial coupling matters more than it would in isolation. This brings us to a phenomenon that does not get nearly enough attention in public discussions of space weather, and that is ionospheric sensitization. The ionosphere, the electrically charged upper layer of Earth's atmosphere, is not a static shield. It responds to solar activity, and repeated exposure to flares and particle events can weaken its resilience over time. Think of it like repeatedly bending a piece of metal back and forth. Each bend does not necessarily break it, but each bend makes the next one slightly more likely to. AR-4366 has been firing repeatedly, and each firing event, whether it produces a direct hit or a near miss, is adding another bend to a system that has already been bent several times. The compounding effect is the key concept here, and it is the reason why watching for one big catastrophic storm is the wrong way to think about this threat. The danger does not have to arrive in a single dramatic moment. It can arrive as a series of moderate events, each one individually manageable, but collectively pushing critical systems closer to their breaking points. Power grids, satellite networks, and communication infrastructure all have tolerances, and those tolerances are designed around normal operating conditions, not around sustained bombardment. When you subject those systems to repeated stress without full recovery time between events, the math changes. This compounding dynamic is one reason why it is genuinely difficult to get traction in public conversations about solar weather risk. A single miss is easy to report. The storm missed Earth, no damage, is a clean, simple headline. The slow accumulation of stress across multiple events over days or weeks does not produce the kind of dramatic moment that drives media coverage. It is harder to quantify, harder to visualize, and frankly harder to explain in a way that feels urgent without sounding alarmist. But that does not make it less real. There is a speculative idea circulating among some solar physicists. And again, it is worth flagging this as hypothesis rather than established science. that repeated flaring from a region like AR 4366 might be doing something to the local magnetic environment between the Sun and Earth. The idea is that each eruption could be subtly reshaping the magnetic pathways that future CMEs travel along, potentially making it easier for a subsequent, larger ejection to reach Earth with less deflection than it would have encountered otherwise. Scientists sometimes describe this as clearing the lane. It is an intriguing concept, and it connects directly to what we observed during the Carrington event, where preconditioning of the magnetic environment before the main impact was a significant factor in how devastating that impact turned out to be. We have always assumed that each solar event is essentially independent, that a miss today resets the board for tomorrow. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the repeated near misses from AR 4366 are not neutral events, but are instead incrementally changing the conditions for whatever comes next? The success bias here is real, and it is dangerous. Every time a CME misses or produces only minor effects, it reinforces a psychological pattern where we treat the threat as manageable. Each miss makes the next miss feel more likely. Each miss makes us slightly less prepared for the event that does not miss. The Carrington event did not arrive from a calm, undisturbed sun. It arrived from a sun that had already been active, already been weakening the systems it was about to overwhelm. AR 4366 is not starting from zero. And the storm that eventually comes from this region, whenever it comes, will not be starting from zero either. Assuming a major geomagnetic storm does hit Earth, and we are not talking about a hypothetical here, but a concrete possibility that the data supports. The next question becomes brutally practical. Are we actually prepared for what happens next? Or have we built a comfortable story about preparedness that does not survive contact with the real event? The answer is complicated, and it depends entirely on which part of the system you are looking at. Some parts have genuinely improved since the last time we were seriously tested. Others have barely moved, and the gap between those two categories is wider than most people realize. The 1989 geomagnetic storm knocked out power across the Canadian province of Quebec for roughly 12 hours and affected millions of people. That event was a wake-up call, and it produced real changes in how power grid operators in North America and Europe monitor and respond to space weather. Forecasting capabilities have improved significantly. Satellites dedicated to monitoring solar activity give us earlier warning than we had in 1859 or even 1989. Space weather agencies issue alerts and advisories, and grid operators have protocols for reducing load and protecting critical transformers when a significant storm is approaching. These are real, concrete improvements, and dismissing them would be unfair. But here is where the story gets uncomfortable. The single most vulnerable component in the modern electrical grid is the high voltage transformer, and the situation with those transformers has not changed nearly as much as the monitoring and forecasting capabilities have. High voltage transformers are not off-the-shelf components. They are custom built for specific substations, and the manufacturing process for a single unit can take anywhere from 12 to 24 months. There is no warehouse somewhere full of spares waiting to be deployed. If a major geomagnetic storm damages a significant number of transformers simultaneously, replacing them is not a matter of days or weeks. It is a matter of many months. There is a persistent myth in public discussions of grid resilience that suggests utilities have stockpiled replacement transformers against this exact scenario. Some have, to a limited extent, but the number of critical high-voltage transformers in any national grid vastly exceeds the number of available spares, and the transformers that matter most, the ones at major transmission nodes that move enormous amounts of power across long distances, are irreplaceable on any short timeline. A handful of those transformers, in the right locations, represent the difference between a functioning national grid and a cascading failure that could last weeks or months. The long-distance transmission lines themselves are also a factor. They act as antennas during a geomagnetic storm, And the longer the line, the more current it can pick up from a changing magnetic field. Government agencies and utility companies have historically been cautious about using worst-case language when discussing solar weather threats. There are understandable reasons for this. Unnecessary panic causes real economic damage. Alarmist messaging erodes public trust in institutions over time. There is also a genuine uncertainty in probability estimates that makes definitive statements difficult to justify. But there is a side effect to this caution that is worth examining honestly. When official communications consistently soften the language around extreme risk, the public and, more importantly, the decision-makers who control infrastructure budgets tend to calibrate their sense of urgency to match that softer language. The gap between what the worst-case scenarios actually look like and what gets communicated publicly is significant. There are voices in the preparedness community who have argued for years that solar weather represents an existential threat to modern civilization, and they have been largely dismissed as alarmist or as conspiracy theorists riding an apocalyptic narrative. Some of them probably are, but some of them are engineers and scientists who looked at the numbers and the dependencies and came to conclusions that the mainstream conversation has been reluctant to engage with seriously. The real divide in this debate is not between people who care and people who do not. It is between those who focus primarily on the probability of a catastrophic event, which is genuinely low in any given year, and those who focus on the consequences if one does occur, which are genuinely severe regardless of how unlikely the trigger event might be. Low probability does not mean low impact. That distinction is one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood ideas in risk management, and it applies directly to what AR 4366 represents right now. Even a moderate geomagnetic storm, one that would not be classified as a Carrington-level event, hitting the modern grid at the wrong moment could produce effects that are far more serious than the word moderate implies. The grid we have today is not the grid we had in 1989. It is more interconnected, more dependent on precise timing signals, and more vulnerable to the kind of cascading failures that compound quickly once they begin. The system looks strong. It looks resilient. It looks like it has been engineered to withstand disruption, and it has been, up to a point. But every engineered system has a threshold beyond which it stops behaving as designed, and we have not tested the modern electrical grid against anything close to that threshold. The question is not whether the system can handle a solar storm. The question is whether we are willing to find out. AR 4366 did not appear on the sun in a vacuum. It appeared during a solar cycle that has been, from the very beginning, behaving differently than the people who study it expected. Solar Cycle 25, the current 11-year period of solar activity we are living through, was forecast by multiple independent modeling teams to be a relatively quiet cycle. The predictions were made using the best available tools and decades of accumulated data about how the sun's magnetic dynamo works. The sun had other ideas. The original forecasts for Cycle 25 suggested it would be weaker than Cycle 24, which was itself a relatively modest cycle. Activity was expected to peak around 2024 or 2025 at levels comparable to or below what we saw in the previous cycle. Solar physicists made these predictions with reasonable confidence, based on models that had performed well in prior cycles. The models were not wrong in a way that reflects poorly on the scientists who built them. They were wrong in a way that reflects poorly on our fundamental understanding of how the sun generates its magnetic activity. And that distinction matters because it tells us something uncomfortable about the limits of what we actually know. The actual behavior of Cycle 25 has exceeded those forecasts significantly. Activity has been higher than predicted, the number of major flare events has been greater than expected, and regions like AR 4366 are producing eruptions at a scale and frequency that the quieter cycle models simply did not anticipate. This is not a minor discrepancy. it is a systematic underestimate, and it has implications for how we think about solar prediction more broadly. When every major forecasting group gets it wrong in the same direction, that is not bad luck. That is a signal that something in the underlying assumptions is off. The reason the model struggled is rooted in something that physicists have long understood in theory, but that remains genuinely difficult to account for in practice. The sun is a nonlinear system. That phrase might sound technical, but the concept behind it is something most people have encountered in everyday life without thinking about it in scientific terms. In a nonlinear system, small changes in initial conditions can produce disproportionately large changes in outcomes. A tiny shift in temperature, in magnetic field strength, or in the flow patterns beneath the solar surface can cascade into behavior that looks dramatically different from what a straightforward extrapolation of past data would suggest. You do not need a big cause to get a big effect. You just need the right small cause at the right moment. And you cannot always identify which small cause that will be until after it has already produced its effect. This is the same basic principle that makes long-range weather forecasting so difficult on Earth, and it applies to the sun with even greater force because the physical processes involved are more extreme and less well observed. We cannot send instruments into the sun to measure what is happening beneath its surface. We can only watch what emerges and try to infer the underlying dynamics from the outside. That inferential gap is where our prediction models break down when the sun decides to behave in ways that fall outside the range of its recent history. We are, in a sense, reading the sun's mood from the expressions on its face and hoping that tells us enough about what it is going to do next. The solar dynamo, the mechanism by which the sun generates and cycles its magnetic field, is one of the most studied and least fully understood processes in astrophysics. We know it involves the interaction between the sun's rotation and its internal convective currents. We know it produces the roughly 11-year cycle of activity that we have been tracking for centuries. What we do not know with any precision is how sensitive that cycle is to small perturbations in the dynamo's internal state. If the answer is very sensitive, then predicting specific peaks and troughs in solar activity becomes fundamentally difficult, not because our models are poorly built, but because the system itself resists prediction at the level of detail we need. Cycle 25 has forced that question into sharp focus because it has shown us exactly what happens when a cycle decides to behave in ways that fall outside the envelope our models were built around. The pattern we are seeing with Cycle 25 is not unique to the sun. Similar dynamics of underestimated extremes show up across a range of complex natural systems. Climate scientists have repeatedly observed that extreme weather events are occurring at rates and intensities that outpace the projections made even a decade ago. Seismologists have noted clustering patterns in earthquake activity that challenge simple statistical models of when and where quakes should occur. In each of these cases, the common thread is the same. Complex systems can produce outlier events that look improbable until they happen, and then they look inevitable in retrospect. The sun is simply the most dramatic example of a pattern we keep seeing everywhere we look. What makes the solar case particularly worth paying attention to is the scale of the consequences. When a climate model underestimates the intensity of a hurricane season, the feedback loop is uncomfortable but manageable. When a solar activity model underestimates the intensity of a flare cycle, the feedback loop includes the possibility of satellites going dark, power grids failing, and communication networks dropping out simultaneously. The stakes attached to getting this prediction wrong are not evenly distributed across all the complex systems we struggle to forecast. The sun sits at the top of that hierarchy because everything else we depend on exists within the environment it controls. AR 4366 fits this pattern precisely. It is not an anomaly in the sense of being inexplicable. It is an anomaly in the sense of being more extreme than our models predicted, in a cycle that has consistently produced more extremes than our models predicted. The sun is not behaving randomly. It is behaving according to physical laws that we understand in broad strokes, but that we cannot yet model with sufficient precision to anticipate the specific timing and intensity of individual events. We can say with reasonable confidence that cycle 25 has more activity ahead of it than the original forecasts suggested. We can say that regions capable of producing major flares will continue to emerge. What we cannot say is exactly when, exactly where, or exactly how powerful. There is also a subtler point worth making here, one that gets lost in most discussions of solar prediction. Even if we improved our dynamo models tomorrow and could forecast the general shape of a solar cycle with much greater accuracy, that would not solve the problem that regions like AR 4366 represent. The emergence of a specific active region, its size, its magnetic configuration, and its behavior. Once it appears, those are determined by local conditions on the solar surface that operate on timescales far shorter than the cycle itself. Predicting when an X-class flare will occur is a fundamentally different problem from predicting whether a solar cycle will be active or quiet. The first requires understanding of surface dynamics that we simply do not have. The second is the part we have been working on for decades, and even that remains imperfect. So when someone tells you that solar scientists have a handle on what is coming, it is worth asking exactly which part of the question they are confident they can answer. Because the part that matters most, the part that determines whether the next big eruption hits us or flies past, is still largely outside our reach. This does not mean catastrophe is guaranteed. It means uncertainty is higher than advertised. And it means the margin between what we expected and what is actually happening is wider than comfortable. The sun is, on average, predictable. Its 11-year cycle is one of the most well-documented periodic phenomena in all of natural science. But averages can be misleading when you are living inside one of the outlier events. AR 4366 is not evidence that the sun has changed. It is evidence that the sun has always been capable of this, and that our models have been systematically underestimating that capability. The sun is predictable in the aggregate. It is dangerous in the extremes. And right now, we are watching it operate very close to one of those extremes. We have spent most of this conversation talking about the sun, about magnetic fields and coronal mass ejections, and the structural complexity of sunspot regions. But the sun is only half of this story. The other half is us, and specifically, the civilization we have built, and how extraordinarily fragile it has become without most of us noticing. The technology that runs our daily lives is not as robust as it feels. It is, in many ways, held together by timing signals and satellite relays and electromagnetic assumptions that have never been seriously tested against a worst-case solar event. And that fact changes everything about what AR 4366 means. We have built the most connected, most capable civilization in the history of this planet. And we have done it almost entirely without asking what happens when the star that made it possible decides to have a bad week. Consider how much of modern life depends on GPS, not just for navigation, but for timing. You probably think of GPS as the thing that tells your phone where you are. It does that, yes, but it also provides extraordinarily precise time signals that power financial transactions, coordinate cellular networks, synchronize power grid operations, and keep internet traffic flowing in the correct sequence. A disruption to GPS timing is not like losing turn-by-turn directions on a road trip. It is a systemic failure that propagates through every network that depends on synchronized clocks, which is most of them. And GPS satellites orbit inside the magnetosphere, making them vulnerable to the same geomagnetic storms we have been discussing. The irony is that the more precisely we have built our systems to depend on those signals, the more completely they fail when those signals disappear. We have not built redundancy into that dependency. We have built depth. The satellite constellation that underpins modern communication is another layer of this fragility. Low Earth orbit satellites are exposed to solar energetic particle events during major storms. Increased atmospheric drag from geomagnetic heating can pull satellites out of their planned orbits, sometimes permanently. Some satellites can be damaged beyond repair by intense radiation events. We saw a preview of this in February of 2022 when a moderate geomagnetic storm caused SpaceX to lose roughly 40 of its newly launched Starlink satellites before they could reach operational altitude. That was not a Carrington-level event. That was a moderately active period, and it still pulled satellites out of the sky. The internet, as we currently experience it, is not a single, resilient network floating free of physical constraints. It is a system that depends, in large part, on hardware in space, and that hardware is vulnerable to the sun in ways that most people have never thought about. Now layer artificial intelligence on top of all of that. AI systems, the ones that are increasingly woven into infrastructure, logistics, financial markets, and communications, depend on the same timing signals, the same satellite relays, the same electromagnetic environment that a major solar storm would disrupt. An AI-driven traffic management system that loses its GPS timing does not gracefully degrade. It stops functioning in ways that are difficult to predict and harder to manually override. An AI system coordinating supply chains across continents that suddenly loses reliable communication with its satellite uplinks does not simply slow down. It makes decisions based on incomplete or corrupted information, and those decisions can cascade. The problem is not just that the AI goes offline. The problem is that it may stay online and keep acting on data that is no longer accurate, and the systems it is controlling may not have a manual fallback that anyone knows how to operate anymore. We have handed over decision-making authority to systems that were never designed to be wrong in the ways a solar storm would make them wrong. This is not an apocalypse scenario. Let me be precise about that, because precision matters here. A major geomagnetic storm would not end civilization. It would not reduce us to the Stone Age overnight. But it would produce something that might in some ways be more difficult to recover from than a single dramatic catastrophe. It would produce systemic paralysis. Multiple critical systems failing simultaneously, not all of them in the same way, not all of them at the same moment, but in a cascading sequence where each failure makes the next one harder to contain. Recovery from that kind of event is not a matter of flipping a switch back on. It is a matter of rebuilding interdependencies one by one, in an environment where the interdependencies themselves have become the problem. And here's the part that makes that recovery genuinely difficult. Most of the engineers and technicians who understand how those interdependencies were originally built are working with systems that have changed significantly since the last time anyone thought seriously about what happens when they all fail at once. The Carrington event is remembered as the story of telegraph wires catching fire. It is a vivid image, and it captures something real about what happened in 1859. But it does not capture what a comparable event would look like today. Today, the equivalent is not wires on fire. It is a quiet, spreading failure across systems that most people do not think about until they stop working. The fragility we have built into the modern world is not the fragility of individual components. It is the fragility of interconnection itself. The more connected a system becomes, the more efficiently it operates in normal conditions. But that same connectivity becomes a transmission pathway for failure when conditions are not normal. We have optimized for efficiency at every level of our technological infrastructure, and efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. In fact, they are often in direct tension with each other. Every time we remove a redundant system because it is not needed under normal conditions, we are making a bet that normal conditions will hold. Solar weather does not care about that bet. Banking is a useful example of how invisible this vulnerability has become. Modern financial systems rely on precise timing synchronization to process transactions, verify accounts, and maintain the integrity of records across networks that span the globe. A disruption to that timing does not just slow transactions down. It can create inconsistencies in financial records that take days or weeks to untangle, even after the storm has passed. The systems are designed to catch errors, but they are designed to catch errors that happen one at a time, not errors that happen everywhere simultaneously, because the clock that everyone is reading suddenly went wrong. A solar storm does not hack into a bank. It simply makes the clock unreliable, and that is enough. The same logic applies to hospitals, to air traffic control, to water treatment facilities. Every system that has been built to trust a shared signal becomes a single point of failure the moment that signal stops being trustworthy. AR 436-6 may fade. It may rotate off the visible face of the sun and decay without producing another major event. Solar regions do that. They build, they burn, and they quiet down, and the world moves on without noticing. That outcome is entirely possible, and it may well be what happens. But the region has also shown us something important about the relationship between the sun and the systems we have built on the planet it illuminates. We have always known, intellectually, that the sun is the engine of life on Earth. What we have been slower to reckon with is that it is also, potentially, the single greatest threat to the technological civilization that life on Earth has produced. That is not a comfortable idea to sit with, and it is not one that fits neatly into the way we normally talk about risk. Most risk conversations assume the threat is something we can see coming, something with a price tag and a probability estimate and a budget line. The sun does not operate on our terms. The question that AR 4366 leaves us with is not whether the sun is dangerous. It always has been. The question is whether we are watching history repeat itself, with a civilization that has grown more vulnerable at precisely the rate that our technology has grown more impressive, or whether we are watching something else entirely, a rehearsal, a warning fired across the void by a system that does not know we exist and does not care what we have built. The sun will keep burning. The cycles will keep turning. And somewhere in the next eruption, or the one after that, or the one after that, the geometry will align. The only question worth asking, the one that should keep scientists uncomfortable and the rest of us paying attention, is whether we will be ready when it does.